Hello friends, and welcome to yet another episode of Economic Sutra. In this episode, we are going to look at something very interesting, which is global perception indices or global opinion-based indices and India's recent scores and rankings on those indices. Now, many of you may be aware that India's economic performance in the last few years, particularly coming out of the COVID pandemic, has actually been quite strong. In fact, by all indicators, we are now the fastest growing economy in the world. We are now also just emerged as the fifth largest economy in the world, and most expectations are that we will, before the end of this decade, become the world's third largest economy. So in the middle of all this good economic performance and also reasonably good macroeconomic management, we have a peculiar situation that India has suddenly begun to perform poorly on a number of subjective global perception indices, which are based on opinions of so-called experts. In indices after indices, India's rank and score have sharply dropped. Now the question is, why is this happening? Now, just so that you get a sense of what we are talking about, these are indices on various subjective kind of subjects, like, for example, democracy, freedom, happiness, and so on. And these indices are very often done by mostly Western think tanks, where countries are ranked according to whatever it is they happen to be studying. Now, interestingly, in most of these indices, India had historically also done quite poorly. But since 2015, and even more sharply since 2019-20, there has been a drop in India's rankings on virtually every one of these indices. So in this episode, what we will do is we will investigate what exactly is going on, what are the methodologies, to what extent are these indicators credible, and I have with me here, of course, my co-author and colleague Akanksha Arora, along with whom I have just authored a working paper for the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. The paper is right here. It's called Why India Does Poorly on Global Perception Indices, and it's available for download freely from the ESCPM working paper series on website. Now, before we go further, let me give you an indication of how some of these indicators have been ranking India. There is an indicator which is published by a Swedish think tank called VDAM, or Varieties of Democracy Institute, which ranks countries and scores them on freedom, on academic freedom. Now, this index, which just came out a few weeks ago, this was at the very end of November 2022, an index was published by this think tank called Academic Freedom Index. Now, on that Academic Freedom Index, India was shown as being in the bottom but one decile, i.e. in the 80th to 90th decile, suggesting we had one of the countries with the worst academic freedom. And that puts us essentially in the same ranking as war-torn countries such as Yemen. Now, even if you believe that, surely it is difficult to believe the rankings that the same index gives to countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan, which are actually ranked two notches up, two deciles up in the 60 to 70th decile. Now, you tell me, what is the credibility of an index where Taliban-ruled Afghanistan gets ranking significantly two levels up from India on something like academic freedom? So the question is, what is driving these indices? And to understand this, we have done a case study of three of these opinion-based indices. One, the Freedom in the World Index, which is done by Freedom House, a US-based index, US-based think tank. EIU Democracy Index, which is done by The Economist, which is obviously a UK-based magazine, which many of you may read. And the Varieties of Democracy Index, which is done by Varieties of Democracy Institute, which is based in Sweden. So we'll go one by one through these indices, and we'll give you a flavor of how India does, but more importantly, what are the methodologies that drive these rankings. So let's begin with the first, which we are going to do, is the Freedom in the World Index. Now, this is done by the Freedom House. It's a US-based think tank. 85% of its funding comes from the US government. It's been around for quite some time, and it's been publishing since 1973 a freedom index, which is widely used. Now, one important thing that comes up very often when we are talking about these indices is, why on earth should we bother about them at all? Some people will say, well, clearly they are biased. Maybe we shouldn't bother with them, just ignore them. And so let me clearly state here that there is a reason why we need to pay attention to these indices, because they do feed through to concrete things. For example, the Freedom in the World Index that I'm about to tell you about, and also the other two, feed into the World Bank's World Governance Indicators. Now, this World Governance Indicators in turn gets used in our sovereign ratings. Something like 18 to 20% of the weightage of our sovereign ratings are derived from these sort of indices from these think tanks. So we can't ignore them. So back to the Freedom in the World Index. This is an index, as I said, been published since 1973. It has a whole bunch of sub-indices, some of them for political rights, such as the electoral process, political pluralism, and so on, and then for civil liberties and freedom of expression, belief, rule of law, and so on. Now, in all these indices, India had always not been a very strong performer, but nevertheless, it was broadly flat for over a decade, till in 2019 it suddenly dropped. So, for example, for the civil liberties category, which is out of 60, India used to, for a long period of time, get a score somewhere in the range of 42, and then it suddenly dropped in 2019 to 40, and kept dropping, and in 2022 it has dropped to 33. Now, similarly, you have the Political Rights Index, which is out of 40. India has to get a very high score of 35 out of 40, and that has now dropped to 33. Smaller drop, but still a drop. And all of this is being driven by these underlying sub-scores in the sub-indices. So let's take, for example, the sub-index on the freedom of assembly. Here, our score used to be in 2018 at 4. Now it is 2. Clearly, there's not been any major decline in our freedoms to assemble, given that just in the last 2 years we have had major protests, like, for example, the farmers' protest or the protest, the CAA. Now, whatever you may think about those issues, the fact is they were protests that went on for months, blocking major roads and highways in the national capital. Now, when something similar happened in Canada with the truckers, a state of emergency was announced and they were thrown out. And clearly, this is not an even-handed assessment of freedom of assembly here in India. And the result of this sort of biased coverage is that India has been now downgraded to a level called partially free, which would put it at the same level that it was during emergency. Now, I don't think any neutral observer would argue that civil liberties in India today are in any way comparable to what they were during the emergency. Equally absurd is the ranking. India is considered partially free, but a territory called Northern Cyprus, on the other hand, has been given a score and rankings well above that of India and is considered actually fully free. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Northern Cyprus. Northern Cyprus came into being because Turkey invaded the island of Cyprus in 1974 and then occupied about the northern one-third of that island. That territory is not recognized as a separate country by the UN and pretty much no other country other than Turkey. It then carried out ethnic cleansing of its Greek population, and yet, according to Freedom House, this territory is considered valid, in fact, is considered a functioning democracy. Let me point out in this context that Freedom House does not recognize Jammu and Kashmir as a part of India. So that is another point that you need to keep in account. Anyway, in order to understand the methodology used by Freedom House, I have with here Akanksha Arora, my co-author and colleague, and she will explain to you the kind of methodology used by Freedom House.
Thank you for having me here, sir. So now to understand how this index called Freedom in the Word Index is put together, you have to understand that it is based on a few set of questions. And mind it, it's only a set of 25 questions on which answers are sought out for all these questions on basically the two categories, political rights and civil liberties. And it is produced by a team of some staff and analysts that Freedom House employs and some set of expert advisors. The report does not mention who the advisors are, what their expertise is, what their nationality is, or any such clarity. On all these 25 questions, each country is ranked on a score from 0 to 4. 4 being the best score and 0 being the worst score. So based on the 25 questions, you come up with a score of how much a country gets out of 100, of which 60 for civil liberties and 40 for political rights. And then the report, there is a cutoff that if a country is above certain cutoff, it is considered as free. Below that it is partially free, and below that it is not free. So India in 2021 has now gone to the category of partially free, and Jammu Kashmir is actually in the category of not free. So only on the basis of these 25 questions and some media reports which their analysts look at, they come up with this scoring and categorize a country as to what is the status of that country or territory. Yeah. So how does EIU puts together this democracy index? It is also based on a set of questions. In this case, there are 60 questions that are asked on 5 categories: electoral process and pluralism, functioning of government, political participation, political culture, civil liberties. So there are about 60 questions spread across these 5 categories that are asked to a set of so-called experts. However, the report does not mention what the expertise of those experts are, what the nationality of those experts are, how many experts from each country are they taking, how they are then trying to maintain cross-country parity among scoring. There is no clarity as to how that happens. So what happens is that on these 60 questions, the experts are supposed to give answers as the score 0 being the worst, then 0.5 and 1. An interesting point about this index is that the report says that they not only depend on the opinion of experts, but they also use something called public opinion polls. And in most cases, they say that the public opinion poll they're using is from something called word value surveys. So about 15 questions, they take the answers from word value surveys in case those surveys have been conducted for those countries. And if the survey has not been conducted for those countries in recent years, then they take the answers for those questions also from the experts. So in case of India, the latest survey that was available was 2012. So essentially from last 1 decade, whatever scoring and whatever ranking we get for democracy index from EIU is based on the perceptions of the experts, not from the public opinion polls. In this case, India has the worst score in civil liberties. It has deteriorated the most. The score on civil liberties has deteriorated the most, and then followed by political culture, to the extent that now our score for civil liberties is much lower than Hong Kong. We have a civil liberty score of 6.18, whereas Hong Kong has a civil liberty score of 7.5, even after the political turmoil that they have faced in the recent years.
Thank you, Akanksha. Now, we will look at the third of these indices. This is the VDAM Democracy Index. Here, again, we see the same pattern where our scores have sharply deteriorated, so much so that almost all the parameters on which they score us, we are now back to levels not seen since the emergency. It is so bad that the VDAM actually had to invent an oxymoron to describe how India's political system works. It calls it an electoral autocracy. So this is where we are at, and yet again let me ask Akanksha to explain their methodology.
So how is this VDAM index put together? VDAM comes up with not 1 but actually 6 indices in their report, which are all related to democracy somehow. So there is an index called liberal democracy, electoral democracy index, liberal component index, and so on. Now, how are these indices put together? They use two kind of variables to put these indices together. One is factual variables. So what are these factual variables? These variables are questions like what is the election type, what is the minimum voting age in the country, what is the population with suffrage in that country, and so on. Another set of questions are again the evaluative indicators which are based on rating provided by these experts. And these are basically again based on the questions that are sent out to experts who fill them, and then scoring on these indices is done and these variables are calculated. VDAM, at least in their report, categorically mentions that they try and use 5 experts per country year for each question for these indicators. And they have said that they use experts generally from academics or media professionals or public affairs professionals. However, who are the experts is not known, but this is the categorization that they provide in their report. So what happens? Once they get the data for all these variables, they aggregate them and come up with some of the sub-indices, and then finally these 6 indices, which basically categorize the country as what kind of democracy is it. And as Sir said that now we are actually an electoral autocracy, not even considered as a democratic country anymore. So where have our scores primarily declined? If you will dig deeper into the reports and go into their detailed data files that they have provided on their website, you'll find that the scores have declined not primarily on the factual indicators, but actually on the indicators that are judged and ranked by experts. I'll give you an example. So for example, factual indicators like share of population with suffrage and all, elected official index, we still get decent scores, we get good scores, and our scores have not declined. However, questions on which experts have ranked us, we have seen the scores going down, which have affected our ranking. I like to bring to your notice one particular sub-index called a direct popular vote. So what is this direct popular vote? This direct popular vote is basically based on how much decisions in your country are actually being taken by using public opinion like referendums and so on. Now this is not a very obvious question to be used to judge democracy in countries of all sizes. This may be okay to use for small countries where the population is less, but it's actually very difficult to use it for countries like India, which have a population of our size. So India gets a score of 0 on this indicator, on this sub-index, whereas surprisingly countries like Afghanistan and Cuba get a small score but greater than 0. So this tells you how the questions that are asked and then answered by experts are not uniform, they are very subjective, and that is why it makes cross-country comparison very, very difficult, and hence the ranking of these countries based on these indices sometimes very, very strange.
Thank you, Akanksha, for that summary. So I hope you've been able to get a sense of how entirely subjective this entire process is, mostly through the opinions of a tiny handful of experts, maybe 4 to 6 of them, who essentially take an opinion about individual countries. And there is, of course, great lack of clarity how cross-country analysis is done. Quite apart from these problem with having subjective opinions from experts, the questions themselves are quite strange. For example, there are questions like, how corrupt is your country? Now, even the best of experts, even if they're completely neutral, would have a variety of opinions and scorings for a question like that. And certainly being able to compare across countries is near impossible to do in any meaningful way. Also interesting are the questions that are not asked. For example, surely in an analysis of democracy, you would have a question asking whether or not the head of state is democratically elected. But if you did include such a question, you would find that many of the constitutional monarchies would end up scoring 0 in that category. For example, Norway and Sweden and Denmark and the Benelux countries, or for that matter the UK and Canada and New Zealand, Australia and so on, which have essentially constitutional monarchies and would obviously not score very well. So both in terms of the kinds of questions that are asked, but also the kinds of questions that are not asked. The net result of all of this is that we have ended up with these very biased, skewed opinion indices, which have, one could argue on why they have suddenly begun to score us down, but certainly very difficult to take them seriously. In fact, some of their methodologies are utterly laughable. Unfortunately, we can't ignore them. Right in the beginning, I told you, many of these indices do feed into concrete things. As I mentioned, the World Governance Index uses many of these indices and creates an index through a weighted average, and that eventually begins to feed through to our sovereign ratings, which is a concrete thing. Even more important, there is a big movement now to include ESG indices. ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance Indicators in all kinds of activities, whether it's trade or investment and other corporate decisions and so on. So this is a big thrust that is being done, particularly with pressure from various NGOs and so on. And conceptually, there is no problem with this. Unfortunately, what may happen is that the same think tanks with the same kind of methodologies will begin to utilize these to, in a sense, run the global narrative and, as I said, again have concrete implications for us. So here in India, we need to take this seriously. We need to challenge many of these methodologies. We need to ask organizations like the World Bank and UN, which give these think tanks legitimacy by asking them to question and ask for transparency. As you saw from what Akanksha told you, there's a great amount of lack of transparency in what is going on. But unless we do this, what will happen is that we will face a new form of colonial domination through the pen rather than historically as it was done with the sword. So I hope you found this episode of Economics Sutra interesting. And so till next time, goodbye.